They say you're not supposed to abandon family. But what if leaving is the only way to save them? This story is about the promise that never really breaks, even when you're gone. Where are you listening from today? Stay with me. Enjoy the story. The rain hammered against the airport windows as Esther Mitchell clutched her husband's arm, her knuckles white with desperation. Around them, chaos erupted in 3 languages she couldn't understand, while armed guards herded panicked tourists toward the departure gates. "Vincent, we have to go now!" she screamed over the sirens wailing outside. "The last flight leaves in 20 minutes!" Vincent's face was pale as he stared at the crowd of evacuees pushing past them. Somewhere in this mass of humanity were Leroy and Georgia, the 8-year-old twins they'd been fostering for the past 6 months during their humanitarian mission in the small African nation of Kalunda, the children they'd grown to love as their own. "I can't see them anywhere," Vincent shouted back, his voice breaking. "The volunteer coordinator said they'd be here with the other children from the orphanage." Esther's heart pounded as she scanned the sea of faces. They'd come to Kalunda as part of a teaching program, never expecting to fall in love with 2 beautiful children who'd lost their parents in a tragic accident. The twins had been living with them in the small compound, attending the local school, learning English, becoming part of their daily routine. But now, as civil unrest tore through the capital city, all foreign nationals were being evacuated immediately. The American embassy had been clear: get to the airport or risk being trapped indefinitely. There, Vincent pointed toward a group of children being led by a local woman in a colorful head wrap. "I see Georgia's pink backpack." They pushed through the crowd, but as they got closer, Esther's stomach dropped. The woman shook her head frantically when they approached. "The twins, Leroy and Georgia. Where are they?" Esther pleaded in broken French. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she explained rapidly in her native tongue. A translator nearby overheard and turned to them grimly. "She says there was confusion at the orphanage. The twins were moved to a different facility yesterday for their safety. She doesn't know where." "What do you mean you don't know where?" Vincent's voice cracked with panic. The loudspeaker crackled to life. "Final boarding call for Flight 447 to London. All passengers must board immediately." This is the last evacuation flight. Esther felt the world spinning around her. They'd spent months trying to navigate the complex adoption process, filling out paperwork, meeting with officials, dreaming of bringing Leroy and Georgia home to Colorado. The twins had started calling them Mama Esther and Papa Vincent just last week. "We can't leave without them," Esther whispered, tears streaming down her face. But Vincent was already pulling her toward the gate. "We have to go, Esther. If we stay, we might never get out. And then we can't help them at all." The next few minutes passed in a blur of anguish and impossible choices. As their plane lifted off into the stormy sky, Esther pressed her face against the window, watching the lights of Kalunda disappear below. Somewhere down there, 2 children were waiting for parents who had just abandoned them. The guilt was suffocating. 3 days later, safely back in their suburban Denver home, Esther sat at her kitchen table surrounded by photos of Leroy and Georgia. Their bright smiles seemed to mock her from every angle. The house felt eerily quiet after months of hearing the twins' laughter echoing through the halls. Vincent paced the living room, his phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, I understand the situation is complicated," he said tersely to someone at the State Department. "But we're talking about 2 children who were in our care. They're expecting us to come back for them." But week after week, the news from Kalunda grew worse. The borders remained closed. Communication was nearly impossible. The humanitarian organization that had sponsored their mission had suspended all operations in the region. "We did everything we could," Vincent said one evening, his voice hollow. "We tried every channel, every contact. The embassy says it could be years before the situation stabilizes." Esther nodded, but inside she was drowning. How do you explain to 2 8-year-old children that the people they trusted most in the world had simply vanished? How do you live with that choice? Months turned into years. The Mitchells tried to rebuild their lives, but the ghost of their decision haunted every family gathering, every quiet moment. They'd framed the last photo taken with the twins, all 4 of them laughing at a local market, Georgia on Vincent's shoulders, Leroy holding Esther's hand. 5 years passed, then 10. Esther, now 52, had graying hair and deeper lines around her eyes. She'd thrown herself into local volunteer work, as if helping other children could somehow balance the scales of her conscience. Vincent, 55, had become quieter, more withdrawn. They rarely spoke of Kalunda anymore, but the silence between them was heavy with unspoken grief. It was a Tuesday morning when the phone rang. Esther almost didn't answer. She was rushing to get ready for work, but something made her pick up. "Mrs. Mitchell." The voice was professional, formal. "This is Agnes Walsh from the Department of State. I'm calling about Leroy and Georgia Tembo." Esther's knees gave out. She sank into a chair, her hand trembling as she gripped the phone. "Are they—" She couldn't finish the question. "They're alive, Mrs. Mitchell, and they've been asking about you." The revelation that would change everything was about to unfold. But first, Esther needed to understand just how dramatically the twins' lives had transformed in the decades since she'd last seen them. What Agnes Walsh was about to tell her would turn their world upside down once again. Esther's heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched the phone, Vincent appearing in the doorway with concern etched across his face. He'd heard her gasp from the kitchen. "Mrs. Mitchell, are you still there?" Agnes Walsh's voice was gentle but professional. "Yes, I'm here," Esther managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Please tell me about Leroy and Georgia. Are they okay?" Vincent rushed to her side, pressing his ear close to the phone so he could hear. "They're more than okay, Mrs. Mitchell. In fact, that's why I'm calling. You see, Leroy and Georgia Tembo have become quite remarkable young people. They've been specifically requesting to meet with you and your husband." Esther's mind reeled. "Requesting to meet? But how did they— we tried for years to find them. The borders were closed. Communications were down. We were told—" "I understand your confusion," Agnes interrupted gently. "The situation in Kalunda has changed dramatically over the past few years. The country has stabilized, and there's been significant development. But Mrs. Mitchell, I need to prepare you for something quite extraordinary." Vincent grabbed Esther's free hand, both of them holding their breath. "Leroy and Georgia didn't just survive after you left. They thrived. They were eventually placed with a remarkable local family, Dr. Wesley Tembo and his wife Edith. Dr. Tembo is a prominent educator and former minister of education. The twins were formally adopted and took his surname." Esther felt tears streaming down her face. "They found a good family. Thank God they found a good family. More than good, Mrs. Mitchell. Under Dr. Tembo's guidance, both children excelled academically. But here's what's truly remarkable. They never forgot you. They spoke about you constantly. About the American couple who showed them kindness, who taught them to dream big, who promised to come back for them." Vincent's voice was hoarse when he spoke. "We tried to come back. We tried everything. Dr. Tembo made sure they understood that," Agnes continued. "He actually spent considerable effort trying to locate you himself over the years. The twins were determined to reconnect with you, and that determination, well, it's led them to some incredible achievements." Esther wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What kind of achievements?" "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm not sure how to prepare you for this. Leroy and Georgia are 18 now. They both just graduated from the International School of Kalunda with the highest honors in the school's history. Georgia has been accepted to Oxford University with a full scholarship to study international relations. Leroy has been accepted to MIT for aerospace engineering, also with full funding." The phone nearly slipped from Esther's fingers. "What? But that's not why they're in the news, Mrs. Mitchell. 3 months ago, Leroy and Georgia founded a non-profit organization called Bridges of Hope. They've been working to connect abandoned and orphaned children across Africa with educational opportunities. In just 3 months, they've placed over 200 children in schools and found families for 50 orphans." Vincent sank into a chair beside Esther, his face pale with shock. "Last week," Agnes continued, "they were invited to speak at the United Nations about their work. The Secretary General called them inspiring young leaders who represent the future of humanitarian work. The media has been calling them Africa's youngest humanitarian heroes." Esther's world tilted. The 8-year-old children she'd left behind, scared, uncertain, lost, had become international heroes. "Mrs. Mitchell, they're in New York right now. They spoke at the UN yesterday, and their speech has been viewed over 2 million times online. But here's the thing. In every interview, every speech, they mention you and your husband. They credit you with teaching them that love doesn't have borders, and that every child deserves a chance to dream. They remember us. Vincent's voice cracked. Remember you, Mr. Mitchell. You're the reason they do this work. Georgia told the UN Assembly that the 6 months she spent with you and your wife taught her what family really means. Leroy said in his MIT interview that his interest in engineering came from watching you fix things around the compound, showing him that broken things can always be made whole again. Esther couldn't breathe. The guilt she'd carried for 10 years was suddenly mixing with pride, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of awe. They want to see us? She whispered. Mrs. Mitchell, they've been trying to find you for years. When their story went viral this week, someone from the old humanitarian organization recognized them and reached out to us. They gave us your contact information. Agnes paused, and Esther could hear papers rustling. I have to tell you something else. Georgia and Leroy are flying to Denver tomorrow. They specifically requested to come to Colorado. They said they have something important to give you, something they've been saving for 10 years. They're coming here? Tomorrow? Their flight lands at 3 p.m. They'll be at the Marriott downtown. But Mrs. Mitchell, they've asked if they could have dinner with you. At your house. They said they want to see the home you told them about. The one with the big kitchen and the garden where you grow tomatoes. Esther looked at Vincent, both of them remembering the countless evenings they'd spent describing their life in Colorado to the twins, painting pictures of a world they'd hoped to share with them. Of course, Vincent said, his voice thick with emotion. Of course they can come. Mrs. Mitchell, I need to prepare you for the media attention. The twins' story has captured international headlines. From orphans to Oxford and MIT is trending worldwide. The local news stations already know they're coming to Denver. This is going to be a very public reunion. Esther's mind was spinning. I don't understand. How did they become so successful? We left them in the middle of a crisis. They were just children. According to Dr. Tembo, whom I spoke with yesterday, the twins were inconsolable for months after you left. But instead of letting despair consume them, they channeled their grief into determination. Georgia taught herself English by reading books about international law. Leroy built radios from scrap metal so he could try to contact the outside world. Agnes's voice softened. Mrs. Mitchell, Dr. Tembo said that every night for 2 years, they would sit by the window and tell each other stories about the day you'd come back. They never stopped believing you would return, and when they finally accepted that you couldn't, they decided to become the kind of people who could find you instead. Esther was sobbing now, 10 years of guilt and grief pouring out of her. There's something else, Agnes continued. The twins have established an endowment fund in your names, the Esther and Vincent Mitchell Foundation for Displaced Children. They've raised over $500,000 already. They named it after us? Vincent could barely speak. They said you were their first family, and that love doesn't end just because circumstances change. Mrs. Mitchell, these young people have spent the last decade proving that the 6 months you spent with them changed their entire trajectory. Esther looked around her kitchen, at the photos of Leroy and Georgia still displayed on her refrigerator, at the life she and Vincent had built while carrying the weight of their choice. What do we say to them? She whispered. How do we explain why we left? Mrs. Mitchell, I think you'll find they already understand. Georgia told a reporter yesterday that sometimes the people who love us most have to make impossible choices. She said that's why she's dedicating her life to making sure no child ever has to face abandonment alone. There was a pause, and then Agnes's voice became more formal. I should mention there will be a press conference tomorrow evening. The twins want to publicly thank you and your husband. The mayor's office has been contacted, and there's talk of giving you both a humanitarian award for your early work in Colunda. Esther felt like she was living in a dream. A humanitarian award for abandoning 2 children, for loving them, Mrs. Mitchell, for showing them what family means, for teaching them that they were worthy of love and capable of greatness. As Esther hung up the phone, she turned to Vincent, both of them staring at each other in stunned silence. They're coming home, Vincent whispered. They're coming home, Esther repeated. But even as she said it, she realized that Leroy and Georgia weren't the same frightened children they'd left behind. They were young adults who had transformed their abandonment into purpose, their loss into a mission to help others. But what Esther didn't know yet was that the twins' visit would reveal a secret that would challenge everything she thought she knew about that terrible day at the airport. A secret that would change how she viewed not just their separation, but the entire decade that followed. The truth was more complex than anyone had imagined, and it was about to turn their reunion into something none of them expected. Esther hadn't slept all night. She'd spent hours pacing the house, cleaning rooms that were already spotless, and staring at the faded photos of Leroy and Georgia that had watched over her kitchen for 10 years. Vincent had been equally restless, checking his phone every few minutes as if time would somehow move faster. At 2:47 p.m., they stood in the Denver International Airport arrivals area, both dressed in their best clothes, hearts pounding with anticipation and terror. Esther clutched a handwritten sign that simply read, "Leroy and Georgia," in her careful cursive. "What if they don't recognize us?" Esther whispered to Vincent. "What if we've changed too much?" Vincent squeezed her hand. "They found us, Esther. After all these years, they found us." The sliding doors opened, and passengers began streaming out. Esther's eyes darted frantically across each face, searching for the children she'd left behind. Then she saw them. They were no longer children. Leroy walked with confident strides, tall and lean at 18, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and dark jeans. His face had the same kind eyes she remembered, but now they held wisdom beyond his years. Beside him, Georgia moved with elegant grace, her hair styled in beautiful braids, wearing a simple but sophisticated dress that somehow made her look both youthful and mature. But it was their smiles that stopped Esther's heart, the same radiant grins that had lit up the compound in Colunda, now illuminating the busy airport. "Mama Esther! Papa Vincent!" Georgia's voice rang out, and suddenly they were running. The embrace was everything Esther had dreamed of, and nothing she'd expected. Leroy towered over her now, his arms strong as he lifted her off the ground. Georgia clung to Vincent, both of them crying openly. "You're so tall," Esther sobbed, reaching up to touch Leroy's face. "And Georgia, you're so beautiful. You're both so grown up." "We never stopped waiting for this moment," Leroy said, his voice deep but trembling with emotion. "Never." Georgia pulled back to look at them both, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We have so much to tell you, so much to thank you for." As they walked through the airport, Esther noticed the way people stared. A few passengers had their phones out, clearly recognizing the twins from news coverage. The headlines from that morning's newspapers echoed in her mind. "Denver couple reunites with twins who became international heroes." In the car, the conversation flowed like a dam had burst. Leroy and Georgia talked about their adoptive parents, Dr. Wesley and Edith Tembo, with deep love and gratitude. "Dr. Tembo saved us," Georgia explained. "But he always told us that you and Papa Vincent had given us our foundation. He said we were lucky to have had two sets of parents who loved us. He helped us understand why you had to leave," Leroy added. "We were angry for a while, especially the first year. But Dr. Tembo explained that love sometimes means making impossible choices." Esther felt tears threatening again. "We tried so hard to come back. We called everyone we could think of. The embassy, the humanitarian organization, even tried to contact local officials. We were told it was impossible." Georgia reached forward from the back seat and touched Esther's shoulder. "We know. Dr. Tembo showed us all the letters you sent to various agencies. He'd been collecting them for years, trying to find you too." "Letters?" Vincent glanced at Esther, confused. "The Red Cross forwarded them to the new government," Leroy explained. "After the country stabilized, Dr. Tembo worked with international organizations to help reconnect families. He found dozens of letters you'd written, Mrs. Mitchell. Letters to the State Department, to humanitarian groups, to anyone who might help you find us." Esther stared at him. "I wrote letters for 3 years. I never got any responses. The postal system was destroyed during the conflict," Georgia said gently. "But Dr. Tembo has them all. He's been saving them for us. He always said that someday we'd be able to thank you properly." As they drove through Denver's familiar streets, Esther felt a surreal mixture of joy and disbelief. These remarkable young people sitting in her car had somehow transformed abandonment into achievement, loss into purpose. "Tell us about your work," Vincent said. "This foundation you started. Leroy and Georgia exchanged a look that Esther couldn't interpret. It's called Bridges of Hope, Georgia began carefully. But Papa Vincent, Mama Esther, there's something we need to tell you about how it really started. Esther felt her stomach tighten. What do you mean? When we were 15, Leroy said, we were selected for a cultural exchange program. We spent a summer in London, studying at an international school. While we were there, we visited the Imperial War Museum. Georgia continued. There was an exhibit about displaced children during conflicts. We were walking through, reading about families separated by war, when we saw something that stopped us cold. Esther's hands began to tremble. There was a photograph, Leroy said quietly. A photograph of the evacuation from Kalunda, the airport, the day you left. We're in it, Georgia whispered. In the background you can see two small figures by the orphanage group. That's us, Mama Esther. We were there. We were at the airport. The car fell silent, except for the hum of the engine. Esther felt the world spinning around her. What? Vincent pulled over to the side of the road, his face pale. The woman who was supposed to bring us to you, Leroy explained. She got scared when the fighting got closer to the orphanage. She decided to take us to what she thought was a safer location. But we broke away from her group. We ran back to the airport on our own. George's voice was barely audible. We were looking for you. We spent hours searching through the crowds, calling your names. We saw the plane take off, but we didn't know you were on it. Esther felt like she couldn't breathe. You were there? You were at the airport? We were there until the very end, Leroy said. The local authorities found us after the last evacuation flight left. We were sitting by the gate, waiting for you to come find us. Vincent turned around in his seat, his face stricken. We looked for you. We asked everyone. The translator said you'd been moved to a different facility. The woman who was supposed to bring us to you panicked, Georgia explained. She told people we'd been taken to safety, but she didn't know we'd run away. By the time anyone realized what happened, it was too late. Esther felt a decade of carefully constructed understanding crumbling around her. You were there. You were right there. And we left you. No, Georgia said firmly. You left because you thought we were safe. You left because you were told we weren't there. You left because you had to. But if we'd looked harder, Vincent's voice broke. Papa Vincent, Leroy said gently. We've spent years thinking about this. Dr. Tembo helped us understand that you made the best decision you could with the information you had. You couldn't have known we were there. Georgia leaned forward. But here's what we realized when we saw that photograph. We realized that even though we didn't find each other that day, we never really lost each other. Everything good that happened to us afterward happened because of what you taught us in those 6 months. Dr. Tembo used to say that love plants seeds, Leroy added. Sometimes those seeds take years to grow, but they always grow. You planted seeds in us, and our work with Bridges of Hope is what grew from those seeds. Esther turned to look at them both, these incredible young people who had somehow transformed a tragedy into triumph. There's something else, Georgia said, her voice taking on a different tone. Something we discovered last year that changes everything about our story. She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. Dr. Tembo gave us this on our 18th birthday. He said we were old enough to understand the full truth about what happened in Kalunda, about why the evacuation was so chaotic, and why so many things went wrong that day. Leroy took the envelope from his sister. Mama Esther, Papa Vincent, what we're about to show you will explain why we're really here, why we've been so determined to find you. It's not just about gratitude. Esther's heart was pounding as Georgia opened the envelope with trembling fingers. It's about justice, Georgia said quietly. And it's about a secret that someone has been keeping for 10 years. She pulled out a stack of documents, and Esther could see official letterheads, stamps, and signatures that meant nothing to her but everything to the twins. The evacuation chaos wasn't random, Leroy said. And our separation from you wasn't just bad luck. Someone made sure we wouldn't make it to that plane. Someone who had their own reasons for wanting us to disappear. Georgia looked directly at Esther, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. We didn't come to Denver just to thank you. We came because we need your help to expose the truth about what really happened that day, and to make sure it never happens to other children. As Georgia spread the documents across her lap, Esther realized that their reunion was about to become something much more complex than she'd ever imagined. The twins hadn't just survived their abandonment. They'd discovered something that could change everything about how the world understood their story. But first, they needed to reveal a betrayal that had been hidden for a decade. Esther's living room had never felt smaller. The four of them sat around her coffee table, the documents spread out like pieces of a puzzle that would reshape everything they thought they knew. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across papers that held secrets none of them were prepared for. Georgia's hands were steady as she organized the documents, but Esther could see the tension in her shoulders. Leroy sat beside his sister, his jaw set with determination that reminded Esther painfully of the 8-year-old boy who used to insist on fixing broken toys himself. "Before we show you these," Georgia began, her voice carefully controlled, "we need you to understand something. Dr. Tembo spent 3 years investigating what happened during the evacuation. What he found, it's going to be difficult to hear." Vincent leaned forward, his face pale. "Just tell us." Leroy picked up the first document, an official letter with the Kalunda government seal. "This is a communication between the evacuation coordinator and someone at the American embassy. It's dated 2 days before the evacuation began." He handed it to Esther, pointing to a highlighted section. "Read this part." Esther's eyes scanned the page, her French rusty but adequate. As she read, her face grew ashen. This says that certain children were to be retained for processing during the evacuation, that their departure would be delayed pending review." "Delayed pending review," Georgia repeated bitterly. "That's bureaucratic language for keep them from leaving." Vincent grabbed the document from Esther's hands, reading it himself. "This is talking about Leroy and Georgia specifically. It mentions them by name." "Why?" Esther's voice was barely a whisper. "Why would anyone want to keep 2 orphaned children from leaving?" Georgia exchanged a look with Leroy before pulling out another document. "Because we weren't actually orphans, Mama Esther. Our parents didn't die in an accident." The silence in the room was deafening. "What?" Vincent's voice cracked. Leroy took a shaky breath. "Our father was Dr. James Tembo, Wesley's older brother. He was a geologist working for an international mining company. 3 months before the evacuation, he discovered something in the northern regions of Kalunda. Something valuable." Georgia continued. "He found evidence of massive lithium deposits, enough to make Kalunda one of the richest countries in Africa. But he also found evidence that the mining company was planning to extract the lithium illegally, bypassing the government and keeping all the profits." Esther felt her world tilting again. "Your father tried to expose them?" "He documented everything," Leroy said, pulling out a flash drive. "Survey reports, emails, financial records. He was planning to present his findings to the Kalunda government and the United Nations. But before he could," George's voice hardened, "there was an explosion at the mining site. The company claimed it was an equipment malfunction. Our parents were killed instantly." Vincent's hands were shaking. "It wasn't an accident." "No," Leroy confirmed. "And we were witnesses." Esther's heart stopped. "Witnesses?" Georgia nodded. "We were with our father that weekend. He'd taken us to see his work site. We were in the trailer when we heard the men arguing outside. We looked through the window and saw everything." Leroy pulled out a photograph, grainy but clear enough to make out faces. "This is security footage from the mining site. These men aren't mining company employees. Dr. Tembo, Wesley, eventually identified them as mercenaries. We were supposed to die in that explosion too," Georgia said quietly. "But our father had sent us to get water from a well about a quarter-mile away. When we heard the blast, we ran back, but it was too late." Esther was crying now, understanding flooding through her. "The mining company knew you'd seen something. They knew we could identify the men who killed our parents," Leroy confirmed. "So when the civil unrest began and foreigners started evacuating, someone made sure we wouldn't make it onto those planes." Vincent picked up another document. "This shows payments. Large sums of money transferred to various officials during the evacuation. Bribes," Georgia explained, "to ensure that certain children wouldn't make it out, to ensure that witnesses disappeared into the chaos." Esther felt sick. "But you did make it to the airport." "Because we escaped," Leroy said. "The woman who was supposed to keep us at the safe facility didn't know why she was being paid to hold us. She just thought it was paperwork delays. When the fighting got worse, she panicked and tried to move us again. That's when we ran." George's voice grew soft. "We ran to the airport because we knew you would protect us. Even as children, We understood that if we could find you and Papa Vincent, we'd be safe. But by then you were already on the plane, Leroy continued. And the officials who had been bribed made sure we were taken into custody immediately after the last flight left. Esther looked at these remarkable young people, understanding now the weight they'd been carrying. You've been living with this knowledge for how long? Dr. Wesley started investigating immediately after he adopted us, Georgia explained. But it took years to gather enough evidence. The mining company has powerful connections. People who asked too many questions had a tendency to disappear. Leroy pulled out a newspaper clipping. This is from last month. The mining company, Meridian International, just announced a major lithium extraction operation in northern Colunda. They're projecting billions in profits over the next decade. Built on our parents' research, Georgia said, her voice hard. Research they stole. Research they killed for. Vincent was studying the documents, his engineering mind organizing the evidence. This is why you became so successful so quickly. You needed to build international credibility to protect yourselves. Exactly, Leroy confirmed. We realized that if we became too visible, too respected, it would be harder for anyone to silence us. Every scholarship, every award, every news article was armor. Georgia smiled sadly. We didn't become humanitarian heroes despite what happened to us. We became heroes to survive what happened to us. Esther felt a surge of pride mixed with horror. And now you're ready to expose them? We've been ready for 2 years, Georgia said. But we needed one more thing. Leroy pulled out a final document. We needed you. Esther stared at him. Us? Why? Because you were there, Georgia explained. You were part of the evacuation. Your testimony about what happened, combined with this evidence, creates an unbreakable case. Vincent frowned. But we didn't know any of this was happening. That's exactly why your testimony is so powerful, Leroy said. You can confirm that the evacuation process was manipulated, that children who should have been on those flights were deliberately held back. Georgia leaned forward. Mama Esther, Papa Vincent, there are other children who disappeared during that evacuation. Children whose families are still looking for them. If we can expose Meridian International, if we can show how they corrupted the evacuation process, we can help other families get answers. Esther felt the weight of it all settling on her shoulders. What do you need us to do? Tomorrow night's press conference, Leroy said. We're not just going to talk about our reunion. We're going to tell the whole story. About our parents, about the mining conspiracy, about how international corporations are using conflict zones to cover their crimes. George's eyes were bright with determination. We're going to announce that we're filing formal charges against Meridian International for the murder of our parents and the attempted murder of children, and we're asking you to stand with us when we do it. Vincent was quiet for a long moment. This is dangerous. If this company is as powerful as you say, they can't touch us now, Leroy said confidently. We're too visible, too connected. The UN, Oxford, MIT, we have protections our parents never had. But you don't, Georgia said, looking directly at Esther and Vincent. That's why we needed to warn you. That's why we couldn't just show up and surprise you with all this. Esther felt a chill run down her spine. Warn us about what? Leroy and Georgia exchanged another look. Meridian International has been monitoring anyone connected to the Colunda evacuation, Georgia said carefully. They've been watching you for years. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. How do you know that? Vincent's voice was barely audible. Leroy pulled out his phone and showed them a series of photographs. Dr. Tembo hired a private investigator last year to ensure our safety. These photos were taken outside your house over the past 6 months. Esther stared at images of her own driveway, her garden, herself getting into her car, strangers watching her home, documenting her routine. They know we found you, Georgia said softly, and they know we're here. Vincent stood up abruptly, walking to the window. You mean they're watching us right now? Probably, Leroy admitted. But Mama Esther, Papa Vincent, that's not the most important thing. Esther looked at him, her heart pounding. The most important thing is that tomorrow night, when we expose them, we're going to make sure the whole world is watching too. They can't silence all of us. Georgia reached across the table and took Esther's hands. We know this isn't what you expected when you agreed to see us. We know this is bigger and scarier than a simple reunion. But will you help us? Leroy asked. Will you help us get justice for our parents and for all the other families who lost children to corporate greed? Esther looked at Vincent, then back at these extraordinary young people who had been carrying this burden for so long. She thought about the 8-year-old children she'd left behind and the heroes they'd become. "Of course we'll help you," she said firmly. "Whatever you need." But as the sun set outside their window, none of them noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street all afternoon, or the figure with a telephoto lens documenting their every move. The final confrontation was about to begin, and not everyone would survive it unchanged. The next morning arrived with unexpected chaos. Esther woke to her phone buzzing incessantly at 6:17 a.m. Vincent was already sitting on the edge of the bed, his face grim as he scrolled through news alerts. "Esther, you need to see this," he said, handing her his phone. The headline made her stomach drop. "Mining giant Meridian International announces major legal victory in Colombia. All historical claims dismissed." Esther sat up quickly, reading the article. "They filed a motion yesterday evening to have all claims related to the 2015 evacuation dismissed based on statute of limitations. It says here that any evidence collected after a 10-year period cannot be used in international court." Vincent's jaw was tight. "They're trying to silence Leroy and Georgia before tonight's press conference." Esther quickly dialed Georgia's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried Leroy with the same result. "They're not answering," she said, panic rising in her voice. Vincent was already getting dressed. "We need to get to their hotel." The drive to downtown Denver felt endless. Esther's mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. When they pulled up to the Marriott, they saw news vans already lining the street. In the lobby, they were met by Agnes Walsh from the State Department, looking harried and concerned. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, thank goodness you're here," she said, approaching them quickly. "We have a situation." "Where are Leroy and Georgia?" Esther demanded. "They're safe, but they're upstairs dealing with some complications. Meridian International has filed an emergency injunction to prevent tonight's press conference. They're claiming that any statements made by the twins could interfere with ongoing business operations." Vincent frowned. "Can they do that?" "Their lawyers are very good," Agnes admitted, "and they have connections in high places. But the twins, they're remarkable young people. They've been expecting this." The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt like an eternity. When they reached the suite, Esther was surprised to find it bustling with activity. Leroy sat at a laptop, typing rapidly, while Georgia was on a video call with someone speaking rapid French. "Mama Esther! Papa Vincent!" Georgia ended her call and rushed to embrace them. "We were hoping you'd come early." Leroy looked up from his computer, his expression a mixture of stress and determination. "Did you see the news?" "We saw it," Vincent said. "What does this mean for tonight?" "It means we accelerate our timeline," Georgia said firmly. "We're not waiting for tonight." Leroy turned his laptop screen toward them. "We're going live on social media in 2 hours. Dr. Tembo is simultaneously releasing all the evidence to journalists in London, New York, and Johannesburg. By the time Meridian's lawyers figure out what's happening, the story will be everywhere." Esther felt a surge of admiration mixed with fear. "But what about the legal injunction?" "They can't stop us from telling our own story," Georgia said, "and they can't stop the truth from coming out." The next 2 hours passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Leroy and Georgia worked with a precision that spoke to years of planning. They had backup servers, international journalists on standby, and a legal team that appeared on video calls from 3 different countries. "How long have you been preparing for this exact scenario?" Vincent asked. "Since we were 16, Leroy admitted. "Dr. Tembo taught us that people like Meridian don't fight fair, so we had to be ready for anything." Georgia was reviewing her notes when her phone rang. She answered in Kalendan, her expression growing increasingly tense. "What is it?" Esther asked when Georgia hung up. "That was Dr. Tembo. Meridian's people are in Colombia right now, pressuring government officials to disavow our story before it goes public. They're offering infrastructure investments, job programs, anything to get officials to publicly doubt our claims." Leroy's fingers flew across his keyboard. "Then we go bigger. Georgia, call the BBC correspondent. And get me the number for that investigative journalist from the Washington Post who's been following African mining corruption." Esther watched these young people orchestrate an international media response with the skill of seasoned professionals. "How do you know how to do all this?" Georgia smiled sadly. When you spend your teenage years knowing that powerful people want you dead, you learn to be strategic about everything. At exactly 2 p.m. they went live. Georgia sat in front of the hotel room's window, Leroy beside her, with Esther and Vincent visible in the background. The live stream started with 200 viewers and grew exponentially as shares and retweets spread across social media. "My name is Georgia Tembo, and this is my brother Leroy," Georgia began, her voice clear and confident. 10 years ago, we were 8-year-old children caught in the evacuation of Kalunda. The world was told we were orphans. That was a lie. Leroy took over. Our parents were Dr. James and Dr. Esther Tembo. They were murdered by mercenaries hired by Meridian International Mining to prevent them from exposing illegal lithium extraction operations. Georgia's voice remained steady as she described their parents' discovery, the explosion, and their own narrow escape. Esther watched the viewer count climb. 5,000, 10,000, 25,000. "We were separated from our American foster parents not by accident, but by design," Leroy continued. Meridian International bribed evacuation officials to ensure that witness children never made it onto evacuation flights. The twins took turns sharing their story, displaying documents on screen, playing audio recordings that Dr. Tembo had obtained through years of investigation. Esther's phone was buzzing constantly with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. "We want to thank the people who saved our lives 10 years ago," Georgia said, turning to look directly at Esther and Vincent. "Esther and Vincent Mitchell taught us that love doesn't have borders, and that family isn't defined by blood. They also taught us that when you see injustice, you fight back." Leroy held up a photograph. "This is a picture of our parents with the survey data that Meridian International stole. Today, we're releasing all of this data to the public. The lithium deposits they're mining belong to the people of Kalunda, not to a foreign corporation." As the live stream continued, Esther noticed Agnes Walsh monitoring her tablet with growing concern. "What is it?" Esther whispered. Agnes showed her the screen. "Meridian's stock price is dropping rapidly. This is having immediate impact." Georgia was now taking questions from viewers in the comments section. "Someone asks why we waited so long to go public. The answer is simple. We needed to be safe. We needed to be strong enough that our voices couldn't be silenced." Leroy leaned forward. "But we also want other families to know the truth. Over 200 children went missing during various evacuations in conflict zones where Meridian operates. We have evidence linking the company to interference in evacuation processes in 3 different countries." Esther felt her phone buzzing again. This time, she recognized the number. It was Vincent's brother calling from California. "Esther, are you okay?" His voice was panicked. "There are news trucks outside our house asking about you and Vincent. What's going on?" Before she could answer, Leroy was speaking again. "We know that by sharing this information, we're taking risks. But silence isn't safety when it comes to corporate violence. Today, we choose to speak." Georgia looked directly into the camera. "To other survivors out there, other families who lost children in suspicious circumstances during conflicts, you're not alone. We're creating a foundation to investigate these disappearances and to help families get answers." The live stream was now approaching 100,000 viewers. Comments were flowing in multiple languages, with journalists requesting interviews and other survivors sharing their own stories. But then Leroy's expression changed as he looked at something off camera. "Georgia," he said quietly. Esther turned to see Agnes Walsh holding up her tablet, her face pale. On the screen was a breaking news alert. Meridian International CEO Herman Blackstone claims African activists using false documents to damage American business interests. Georgia's jaw tightened. "Mr. Blackstone, if you're watching, and we know you are, we invite you to explain to these 100,000 viewers why your company's security footage from the Kalunda mining site has been classified for 10 years. Leroy added, "And we invite you to explain why your company has spent over $2 million monitoring the families of children who survived the Kalunda evacuation." Esther felt a chill as she realized what they'd just revealed. The twins weren't just exposing the past. They were threatening Meridian's ongoing operations. Georgia looked directly into the camera one final time. "We know that sharing this truth comes with consequences, but we also know that our parents would be proud of us for choosing justice over safety. In 1 hour," Leroy announced, "we'll be releasing the complete archive of evidence to every major news organization in the world. Meridian International, your 10-year cover-up ends today. As they ended the live stream, the room fell silent except for the constant buzzing of phones and tablets. "It's done," Georgia said quietly, but Agnes Walsh was looking at her tablet with growing alarm. "There's something you all need to see," she said. "Meridian just issued a statement claiming that the twins are being manipulated by foreign interests trying to destabilize American mining operations abroad." Leroy laughed bitterly. "They're trying to make us look like we're being used." "That's not the problem," Agnes said, her voice tense. "The problem is that they're also claiming that anyone harboring or supporting the twins could be considered complicit in economic terrorism." Esther felt the blood drain from her face. "What does that mean?" Agnes looked directly at her and Vincent. "It means they're coming after you, too." As if on cue, Vincent's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but when he answered, the voice was coldly professional. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Herman Blackstone. I think it's time we had a conversation." The final battle was about to begin, and the stakes had just become higher than any of them had anticipated. The voice on Vincent's phone was smooth, controlled, and utterly chilling. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Herman Blackstone, CEO of Meridian International. I believe we need to discuss the unfortunate situation involving the young people you're harboring." Vincent put the phone on speaker, his hand trembling slightly. "I'm not harboring anyone. Leroy and Georgia are adults making their own choices." Blackstone's laugh was cold. "Mr. Mitchell, let's not play games. Your emotional connection to these individuals has clearly clouded your judgment. They're spreading dangerous misinformation that threatens legitimate business operations and American interests abroad." Georgia stepped closer to the phone, her voice steady and clear. "Mr. Blackstone, this is Georgia Tembo. Would you like to explain to Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell why your company has spent the last 10 years monitoring their home?" There was a pause before Blackstone responded. "Miss Tembo, you're a bright young woman who's been tragically misled by anti-corporate activists. The documents you've shared are fabrications designed to damage American business interests in Africa." Leroy moved to stand beside his sister. "Then you won't mind if the FBI forensics team examines the flash drive containing your company's internal communications about the lithium deposits? The one our father saved before you had him killed?" "I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to," Blackstone said smoothly. "But I do know that making false accusations against a Fortune 500 company can have serious legal consequences." Esther found her voice. "Are you threatening children, Mr. Blackstone?" "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm offering assistance to a family that's clearly been manipulated by foreign interests. Meridian International has always been committed to supporting American families. In fact, we'd be happy to establish a substantial trust fund for your welfare if you could help these young people understand the gravity of their situation." Vincent's anger flared. "You're trying to bribe us?" "I'm trying to help you avoid becoming collateral damage in a situation you don't fully understand," Blackstone replied. "These accusations could result in federal investigations, media scrutiny, and legal proceedings that could destroy your quiet lives in Colorado." George's eyes hardened. "Just like you destroyed our parents' lives? Your parents died in an industrial accident, Miss Tembo. Tragic, but hardly unprecedented in mining operations. The conspiracy theories you've constructed are understandable given your trauma, but they're not based in reality." Leroy pulled out his laptop and started typing rapidly. "Mr. Blackstone, are you currently watching the international news? I'm aware of the unfortunate media attention your accusations have generated. Then you're aware that the president of Colunda just announced the immediate suspension of all Meridian mining operations, pending a full investigation into illegal resource extraction," Leroy said, his voice gaining strength, "and that the African Union has launched a formal inquiry into corporate interference in refugee evacuations." Esther watched Blackstone's composed facade crack slightly. "Those are temporary political reactions. Business will resume once cooler heads prevail." Georgia smiled grimly. "You might also be interested to know that 3 other families of missing children have come forward in the past 2 hours, all connected to Meridian operations, all with stories remarkably similar to ours." "Mr. Blackstone," Vincent said, his voice gaining confidence, "it sounds like you have bigger problems than 2 teenagers and their foster parents." The pause on the line was longer this time. When Blackstone spoke again, his tone had shifted from smooth persuasion to barely controlled threat. "Mr. Mitchell, Mrs. Mitchell, you have no idea what you're dealing with. Meridian International has contracts worth billions of dollars. We employ thousands of people. We have relationships with governments across 3 continents. If you think 2 African children with fabricated documents can bring down a company like ours, you're gravely mistaken. Agnes Walsh, who had been monitoring news feeds on her tablet, suddenly looked up with wide eyes. "You all need to see this," she said, turning her screen toward them. The headline read, "Breaking, EU announces emergency session on corporate crimes in conflict zones. Meridian International under investigation." Georgia took the tablet and read quickly. "The European Union is freezing all Meridian assets pending investigation. The UK is opening a formal inquiry into the deaths of Dr. James and Dr. Esther Tembo. And," she paused, her voice catching with emotion, "the International Criminal Court is considering charges of crimes against humanity." The silence on the phone stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "Mr. Blackstone?" Vincent said. "Are you still there?" When Blackstone's voice returned, it was stripped of all pretense. "You have no idea what you've done. Meridian has invested 15 years and hundreds of millions of dollars in African operations. We've brought jobs, infrastructure, development to some of the poorest regions in the world. Built on theft and murder," Leroy said quietly. "Built on business," Blackstone snapped. "Do you think the world runs on good intentions? Do you think mineral extraction happens without complications? Your parents were interfering with operations that provide lithium for electric car batteries, for renewable energy storage, for the technology that will save the planet from climate change." Georgia's voice was ice cold. "Don't you dare use environmental protection to justify murdering our parents. Your parents were naive idealists who didn't understand the bigger picture," Blackstone continued, his composure completely gone now. "They would have tied up those lithium deposits in legal proceedings for decades, while the world burns from fossil fuel emissions." Esther stared at the phone in disgust. "You actually believe that justifies what you did?" "I believe that progress requires difficult choices," Blackstone said. "Choices that people like you, living in your comfortable suburban lives, will never have to make." Leroy was typing again, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Mr. Blackstone, you should know that this entire conversation has been recorded and is currently being live-streamed to about 50,000 viewers." The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line was audible. "You might want to check your company's stock price," Georgia added sweetly. "I believe it's dropped about 40% in the last hour." Vincent couldn't help but smile as he heard papers rustling frantically in the background of Blackstone's call. "This isn't over," Blackstone said, his voice tight with rage. "Meridian International has resources you can't imagine. Legal teams, government connections, security contractors. If you think exposing us ends this, you're wrong. It escalates it." Georgia stepped closer to the phone. "Mr. Blackstone, there's something you need to understand. We're not 8-year-old children hiding in a compound anymore. We're Oxford and MIT students with international media attention and government protection. We have the African Union, the European Union, and the International Criminal Court paying attention to our story," Leroy added. "And we have something else you don't." "What's that?" Blackstone's voice was pure venom now. "We have the truth," Leroy said simply. "And once the truth is out, you can't put it back." The line went dead. Agnes Walsh was staring at her tablet in amazement. "Meridian's stock has been suspended from trading. The FBI has announced they're opening a federal investigation, and," she paused, scrolling through alerts, "the Secretary of State is calling for a complete review of American corporate operations in conflict zones." Esther sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. "Is it really over?" Georgia sat beside her, taking her hand. "The legal battles will take years. Blackstone was right about that. But yes, Mama Esther, it's over. They can't hurt any more families. They can't silence any more children." Leroy closed his laptop and joined them. "Dr. Tembo always told us that justice isn't about revenge. It's about making sure the truth protects other people." Vincent looked at these remarkable young people, no longer the frightened children he'd left behind, but powerful advocates who had transformed their trauma into triumph. "What happens now?" he asked. Georgia smiled, and for the first time in days, it was a smile of pure joy rather than determined resolve. "Now we go home to Colorado. All of us. Together." Leroy nodded. "We start the next phase of our lives. Georgia goes to Oxford, I go to MIT. But we also expand bridges of hope. There are hundreds of families who still need answers about missing children. And, Georgia added, looking directly at Esther and Vincent, we learn how to be a family again. All four of us, if you'll have us. Esther felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the beautiful irony of their story. They'd lost the twins to save them from danger, and the twins had found them again to save other children from the same fate. Of course we'll have you, she whispered. You're our children. You've always been our children. Vincent pulled out his phone and showed them a text message that had just arrived. This is from our neighbor. She says there are news trucks outside our house, but also a group of families holding signs that say, "Thank you for raising heroes." Leroy laughed, the same bright laugh Esther remembered from a decade ago. I think we're going to need a bigger dining room table for family dinners. 3 months later, Esther stood in her kitchen preparing Sunday dinner for 6. Leroy and Georgia were home from their first semester at MIT and Oxford, respectively. Dr. Wesley and Edith Tembo had flown in from Columbia, where they were now overseeing the ethical redistribution of lithium mining profits to local communities. The international trials were ongoing. Herman Blackstone had been arrested and extradited to face charges in 3 countries. Meridian International had been dissolved, its assets distributed to families affected by their operations. But more importantly, Leroy and Georgia's foundation had helped reunite over 50 families with missing children. Their story had inspired new international protocols for protecting children during conflicts. As Esther watched her expanded family laughing around her dinner table, she realized that sometimes the most devastating losses lead to the most beautiful discoveries. They'd learned that love doesn't end with separation, that justice can triumph over corporate power, and that children who are taught to dream big can change the world. Georgia looked up and caught Esther's eye, raising her glass of water in a toast. To family, Georgia said simply. All the different ways it finds us. To family, they all echoed, and Esther knew that this time, nothing would ever separate them again. The twins had come home as heroes, but more importantly, they'd come home. If you've made it this far, thank you. I hope Leroy and Georgia's story made you believe that even the deepest loss can become hope for others. If it did, consider subscribing, and I'll see